Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman, and joining us right now on the phone from Washington, D.C. is United States Senator from Wisconsin, Ron Johnson. Happy New Year, Senator.
Happy New Year to you, John.
All right, I want to talk about this fiscal cliff deal. You, of course, voted in favor of the recent deal to avert the sequestration cuts and tax hikes on the middle class. But, of course, this also raises tax rates on some of the wealthiest Americans. Why did you eventually decide to support it?
Well, first of all, it does not raise taxes on anybody. What raises taxes on people are the 2001 and 2003, what I would say, not unwise tax cuts that expired. They were temporary. And so that's really what raised people's taxes. What I was faced with was a very simple choice. After a thoroughly disgusting process coming out of a totally dysfunctional United States Senate and totally dysfunctional Washington, we literally had, less than a half hour to consider whether we wanted to vote for a bill. And by the way, it required a piece of legislation that the president was willing to sign to prevent every American's income taxes from increasing. And so, in the end, I thought it was probably best if I could shield 98 to 90% of Americans from having their taxes increase and basically keep $3.5 trillion out of the federal government's coffers over the next 10 years. I thought the economic harm that would have come from a tax increase that really would have equaled on an annual basis close to $500 billion this year, the economic damage, the harm to people's livelihoods would be so severe that was the number one consideration, and that's why I decided to vote yes. But trust me, John, I fully understand why people voted no. This was a disgusting process. It's business as usual in Washington. It's a bill that a must-pass piece of legislation that those are the kind of Christmas trees that the business as usual here in Washington then loads up with all kinds of ornaments, and we saw that as well. So, I mean, I didn't like voting for it, but I certainly just couldn't stand by and watch 98 to 99% of Americans have their income taxes increased.
I want to read a quote that came from President Obama, and you may have heard this already, and I'm quoting the president here. Republicans in Congress said they'd never agreed to raise taxes on the wealthiest Americans. We've now raised those rates permanently, making our tax code even more progressive, I should say, than it's been in decades. I wanted to get your reaction to the president's comment.
Well, President Obama has no idea how to work with people in a bipartisan fashion, in good faith. He has not negotiated with the Republicans in good faith since I've gotten here, which is one of the reasons Leader McConnell had to reach out to Vice President Biden to actually be able to close a deal. I mean, the fact that President Obama is basically taunting Republicans, that he's spiking the football, I mean, this is not the way to set up good relationships with Republicans here in Congress so that we can deal together in a cooperative and good faith effort to start solving the very serious problems facing this nation. I mean, yeah, President Obama won. He won the election. Republicans had no power in these negotiations. We had no leverage. So he was going to get what he wanted. Our role was limiting the damage. But the fact of the matter is this revenue, and that's CBO scored. I doubt you'll even get that amount of revenue because you'll create economic harm, which is going to lower the tax revenue, if anything, from this bill. But this, if you take the CBO score, it will only address, let's say, 5% of the deficit this year. So I think it's a legitimate question for Republicans to ask, and quite honestly, for the American public to demand of President Obama. Okay, President Obama, you said you're going to tax the wealthy. You got that. You punished success. Now you also talked about a balanced approach to reduce our deficit and stabilize our debt. So what's your solution for the other 95% of our deficit?
Now, the way
the
president...
How are you going to save Social Security? How are you going to save Medicare? How are you going to reduce the size of government, reduce our debt, and stabilize the debt? That is where this debate is shifting. And it's also, he's delusional if he really believes that we're not going to have a debate on this debt ceiling.
Yeah, I want to talk about that. You know, the way the president kind of rubbed this in the Republicans' noses collectively over the last few days, will this affect him? Will there be a price to pay during the debt ceiling negotiations?
Well, it's a price to be paid by the American public because they elected a man who doesn't know how to really work with people, doesn't negotiate in good faith, doesn't have a clue how to create jobs, and doesn't have a clue how harmful his ideology and his policies are in terms of economic growth. So yeah, that's a real problem. And of course, you're rubbing Republicans' noses in it is just the worst possible way of trying to develop a good, trusting, working relationship with people that you're going to have to work with to solve the problems. I mean, let's face it, he won the election, but so did members in the House. I mean, they have every bit of a mandate to the people that elected them as President Obama has from the people that elected him. So this is where it's true. The solutions are going to have to be bipartisan. Neither side is going away, so you better learn how to work with each other. And I can't imagine the president setting a poorer example and establishing a worse tone than what he did over this fiscal cliff.
Your colleague in the Senate, Pennsylvania's Pat Toomey, said that he'd be willing to talk about shutting the government down if the president doesn't come to the table with some cuts, talking about this debt ceiling. Do you agree with Senator Toomey? Are you willing to shut the government down to get the cuts?
Well, John, first of all, let me accurately describe past history because people have revised it. We got a debt downgrade after the last debt ceiling debate, and revisionist history talks about that debt downgrade being caused by the messy debate, those crazy Tea Party folks. We got a debt downgrade because the result of that messy debate was that we didn't solve the problem. And, every time the president asks and Congress contemplates increasing the debt ceiling, in other words, giving the president the authority to burden our children and grandchildren with trillions of dollars of more debt, that is a moment in time that we need to use to inform the American public about what's happening in this country, because enough Americans simply don't understand. If they understood, there's no way President Obama would have been elected initially or been reelected. So we've got to take that moment, and we've got to make sure that we break through the communication barrier by telling America how serious our problems are. So, yeah, you bet. This is going to be a debate that we're going to have on this debt ceiling and the next one and the next one until the Democrats are serious about fixing these problems and work with us in good faith on a bipartisan basis to put us on a long-term fiscally sustainable path.
Is a government shutdown the last piece of leverage the GOP has?
Well, what Senator Toomey's talking about is a phased shutdown. So if we can pass things, like the Full Faith and Credit Act, which guarantees that, what is being funded, you don't need a full government shutdown because you're still going to get revenue into the federal government. So we don't have to totally shut down the government. That's just the threat that the administration uses to scare Americans to create this type of brinkmanship. It doesn't have to be a crisis if we plan for it. That's what we talked about in the last debt ceiling debate. We have these trust funds for Social Security and Medicare. We refuse to tap into them when we reach the debt ceiling. We should make sure that we utilize these trust funds. It's about the only thing they're worth. So there is a way of doing this without threatening everybody's livelihood, but at the same time utilizing the leverage under the debt ceiling to make sure that we get real reforms so that we put our country on a fiscally sustainable path. If we don't solve this ourselves, our creditors will solve it for us. And here's a couple facts that people need to understand. From 1970 to 1999, the average interest rate of the federal government was 5.3% when we were a far more creditworthy nation. We've been borrowing for the last 3 years to facilitate all the steps of spending at 1.5%. If we just revert to that average borrowing cost, 5.3%, that would add $600 billion per year in our interest expense. I mean, that's shocking. We have blown through the $2.1 trillion additional debt limit in 17 months. Every individual American's share of the current federal debt is $51,000. If you're a Greek citizen, your share of that federal debt is only $36,000. These are facts and figures Americans must understand so we start coming to grips with this financial situation as soon as possible.
Yeah, and everybody should write them down on paper, too, because they're staggering when you sit there and hold them in your own hands. The other issue I want to talk about, of course, here is growth. A lot of people talked about this uncertainty in the economy right now and that lawmakers needed to do something to give private industry, private businesses, some certainty with their taxes, perhaps with regulation as well. Is there anything in this deal, anything at all, that's going to add to that level of certainty that so many business owners are asking themselves right now? What's going to happen to my taxes in the future?
Well, John, I think first of all, that is one of the reasons I voted yes. Yes, this does, bring some level of certainty. Now, all these tax changes are permanent. Now, in Washington, probably the better way of saying that is not temporary. We haven't created another one of these fiscal tax cliffs by what we've done. So for 99% of Americans, their tax situation is pretty certain going well out into the future. And even more so, as long as you keep electing Republicans, we're not going to vote to raise people's taxes. we didn't do it now, and we're not going to do it in the future. So yeah, we have, from a tax standpoint, created a great, I think, returned a lot of certainty to the American economy. But what's still uncertain is because we haven't really addressed in any serious fashion the debt and deficit issue. I mean, that is still a huge hangover over this economy, which is why I am encouraging President Obama to start getting serious, to start working with us in good faith, quit spiking the football, and come to the table and let's start hammering out these problems so we can return full certainty to our economy.
Now, we are hearing from some of the more conservative voices outside of Washington. They're growing a little bit louder, voicing displeasure with the GOP, the leadership in the House, even some senators like yourself who voted in favor of the deal. Do you expect, though, for there to be any sort of serious challenge to House Speaker John Boehner and perhaps some other leadership positions, both in the House and the Senate, moving forward?
Not that I'm aware of, and listen, I do believe that both John Boehner and Mitch McConnell are sincere in their desire to fixing this. But again, people need to be realistic in terms of what you can do when you only control the House. And you can argue, boy, you could have done a better job of negotiating with an incredibly weak hand. That's Monday morning quarterbacking. But I mean, the fact of the matter is, President Obama was demanding taxes to increase on everybody making $200 as an individual or $250 and above. And we end up with $400 and $450. So at least we were able to limit the damage to a certain extent when we're in a situation where we have no leverage. We have leverage on the debt ceiling, and that will be the challenge for leadership. And I think, rank and file members will hold everybody's feet to the fire to make sure that we utilize that leverage to the maximum and utilize that moment to first and foremost inform the American public so that we get public opinion on our side for starting to seriously address these problems.
And that is a challenge. We heard that from former Florida Governor Jeb Bush talking about the messaging challenge. Good luck with that, Senator. And we'll talk to you again here before this debt ceiling comes up. Thanks so much for spending some time with us.
Have a Happy New Year. Take care.
Happy New Year to you.